The sun rose over Jerusalem on a winter morning in the year of our Lord 1174, casting long shadows across the pale limestone walls of the royal palace, and within those walls, in a chamber thick with the scent of myrrh and frankincense, a boy of 13 stood before a polished bronze mirror, watching his reflection betray him. Baldwin, fourth of that name, King of Jerusalem, anointed ruler of the Frankish territories in Outremer, had just noticed that his right hand no longer felt the heat of the candle flame he held, too close to his palm. The discovery came not with pain, but with its absence, a void where sensation should have been, and in that moment, though he did not yet understand the full measure of what this meant, the trajectory of his life and the fate of the Crusader kingdom shifted irrevocably toward darkness. His tutor, William of Tyre, the learned archbishop who had educated the young prince in Latin, Greek, theology and the arts of governance, had been the first to observe the troubling signs during a lesson months earlier, when Baldwin, engaging in rough play with other noble boys, showed no reaction to injuries that should have made him cry out. William, a man of letters and observation, had watched with growing unease as the child continued his games with arms and hands bearing scratches and bruises of which he seemed entirely unaware, and the archbishop, versed in both scripture and the medical knowledge preserved from antiquity, began to suspect what he could scarcely bring himself to name. The disease that was claiming Baldwin's body had many names across many lands. The Phoenicians had known it, the Egyptians had recorded it in their papyri, and it lingered in the biblical consciousness of every Christian as the ultimate mark of divine disfavour. The affliction that rendered a man not merely sick but unclean, cast out from human society, condemned to cry "unclean, unclean," and live apart from all that made life worth living. Leprosy, that word whispered in corridors, that diagnosis that could unmake kings and reduce the mightiest warrior to a shuffling outcast, had chosen for its dwelling place the body of the boy king upon whom rested the survival of Christian dominion in the Holy Land. But Baldwin was not yet ready to accept this sentence, nor were those around him willing to speak aloud what they increasingly feared, and so the court continued its elaborate dance of denial, while the disease advanced with patient, inexorable certainty. The kingdom of Jerusalem in that era existed as a slender thread of Frankish settlements along the Levantine coast, hemmed in by Muslim powers that had never reconciled themselves to the presence of these Western invaders who had seized the holy places of Islam and established their alien rule over lands that had known Arab governance for centuries, since Godfrey of Bouillon had refused the title of king, accepting instead the designation advocate of the Holy Sepulchre, and his brother Baldwin had set the kingdom on firmer foundations. The Frankish settlers had created a curious hybrid society where European feudalism grafted itself onto the complex religious and economic systems of the Eastern Mediterranean. The Frankish nobility who ruled this precarious realm lived in constant awareness of their vulnerability, outnumbered by the indigenous population, dependent on a thin stream of reinforcements from Europe, locked in an endless struggle with powers that commanded vastly greater resources. Nur ad-Din, the formidable Turkish ruler of Syria, had spent decades consolidating Muslim resistance to the Crusader presence, and though he had died in the very year of Baldwin's accession, his legacy endured in the structures of military and religious revival he had fostered. More ominously, Nur ad-Din's lieutenant in Egypt, a Kurdish soldier of extraordinary ability named Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known to the Franks as Saladin, had seized power in Cairo and now ruled a realm that stretched from the Nile to the Euphrates, encircling the Crusader states in a tightening embrace. This was the geopolitical reality into which young Baldwin had been thrust, a chessboard where every move carried existential stakes, and where the personal capacities of the king mattered intensely in ways that would have been less critical in the established monarchies of the West. The Frankish lords of Outremer were a fractious, proud, and often reckless breed, men who had carved out their fiefs with swords and who regarded the authority of the crown as something to be negotiated rather than assumed. They fought among themselves with an intensity that often seemed to ignore the external threats facing the kingdom, pursuing vendettas and territorial ambitions even as Saladin marshalled his forces. Into this cauldron of competing ambitions stepped Baldwin, a boy whose claim to the throne descended through his mother, Amalric's wife, Agnes of Courtenay, a woman whose prior marriage had been annulled on grounds of consanguinity after Amalric became king, leaving Baldwin's legitimacy forever shadowed by whispers and canonical doubts. His father Amalric had been a capable, if ruthless, king, a man who understood the necessity of maintaining the delicate balance between the various factions of the kingdom while seeking to expand Frankish territory through campaigns against Egypt. Amalric had died suddenly in July of 1174, struck down by dysentery at the age of 38, and because his son, by his second, unquestionably legitimate marriage, was still a young child, Baldwin, despite the questions surrounding his birth, despite the rumours already circulating about his health, had been crowned in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre with all the ceremony and sacred oil that could make a king legitimate in the eyes of God and man. The regency that should have protected the boy king during his minority fell to Miles of Plancy, a loyal servant of Amalric. But Miles lasted only a few months before he was cut down by assassins in the streets of Acre, murdered in a plot whose origins remained murky, but whose beneficiaries were clear enough. Power then shifted to Raymond III of Tripoli, a thoughtful, cautious man who had spent years in Muslim captivity and had emerged with a sophisticated understanding of the enemy's strengths and the kingdom's vulnerabilities, and Raymond assumed the regency with the support of the High Court, the assembly of barons who theoretically advised the king but in practice often dictated to him. Baldwin's education under William of Tyre had been thorough, perhaps more thorough than that of most Western princes, because William understood that the King of Jerusalem needed not merely the formal learning of a monarch, but the subtle intelligence required to navigate the treacherous currents of Levantine politics. The boy had learned to read and write in multiple languages, to understand the theological disputes that divided Christendom, to appreciate the historical parallels between his own situation and that of the ancient kingdoms whose ruins dotted the landscape. William had taught him that Jerusalem had been conquered and lost and reconquered throughout history, that the city sacred to three faiths had always been a prize that empires contested, and that the Frankish hold on it was, in the long perspective of history, a recent and possibly temporary phenomenon. This education bred in Baldwin a certain fatalism, a recognition that his personal desires mattered less than the duties imposed by his position, and this sense of duty would become his defining characteristic as the disease progressively stripped away his capacity to fulfill the physical demands of kingship. The symptoms advanced slowly at first, slowly enough that those who saw Baldwin daily might convince themselves that nothing was truly wrong, that the slight numbness in his extremities was a passing ailment, that the subtle changes in his appearance were merely the normal transitions of adolescence. But William of Tyre knew better, and the physicians who examined the king in secret knew better, and gradually the truth that they tried to contain began to seep through the court like water through limestone, impossible to fully stop, poisonous in its implications. By 1176, when Baldwin was 15, the disease could no longer be hidden from those who looked closely. His face had begun to show the early signs of leonine features, the slight thickening and coarsening that leprosy could produce, though he remained recognisable, still handsome in the way of his Norman ancestors. His hands, however, told a clearer story. The fingers of his right hand had begun to curl, the muscles weakening as the nerves died, and he had learned to conceal this by carefully positioning himself, by assigning tasks to servants that he would once have done himself, by the thousand small adaptations that the intelligent sufferer develops to hide his condition from a world that will not understand. He could still ride, still hold a sword, still present the image of a warrior king that his barons expected, but each of these activities required more concentration, more careful planning, more willful denial of what his body was telling him. The chroniclers of the era, writing decades later when the truth could no longer be suppressed, would remember these years with a kind of awed admiration, marvelling that a youth so afflicted could have maintained his authority, could have led armies, could have faced down Saladin himself in battle. But they wrote from a distance and could not convey the daily reality of Baldwin's existence, the pain that came not from the disease itself, which destroyed sensation, but from the injuries he sustained because he could not feel them, the infections that followed those injuries, the fevers that racked him, the exhaustion that came from maintaining the performance of health when his body was slowly betraying him. In November of 1177, Saladin launched a major invasion of the kingdom, bringing with him an army that numbered perhaps 26,000 men, a force so large that it seemed certain to overwhelm the meagre defenders that Baldwin could muster. The Sultan had calculated that the young king, inexperienced and reportedly ill, would not dare to face him in open battle, and indeed most of Baldwin's advisers counselled caution, urged the king to withdraw behind the walls of Jerusalem and wait for Saladin to exhaust himself in sieges. But Baldwin, perhaps recognising that his time for military glory was limited, perhaps driven by the need to prove himself in the most traditional way a medieval king could prove himself, chose instead to seek battle. He gathered every available knight, perhaps 500 men at arms along with their supporting infantry, a force absurdly small compared to Saladin's host, and he marched south from Ascalon, following the Muslim army as it advanced carelessly toward Jerusalem, fattened on plunder and confident in its overwhelming superiority. Saladin had divided his forces, sending raiding parties in multiple directions to maximise the destruction and terror, and he himself rode with only a portion of his army when Baldwin, advised by Raynald of Châtillon, the infamous Lord of Kerak whose provocations would eventually doom the kingdom, saw his opportunity. At Montgisard, near Ramla, on the morning of November 25, 1177, the small Frankish force fell upon Saladin's column with desperate fury, and what should have been a massacre of the outnumbered Christians became instead a rout of the Muslims. The battle unfolded with chaotic violence, the heavily armoured Frankish knights smashing into the more lightly equipped Muslim cavalry, breaking their formations, turning confidence into confusion, and confusion into panic. Baldwin himself, just 16 years old, his right hand already weakened by disease but still able to grip a sword, rode at the front of the charge, and the sight of the crowned king leading his men inspired them to feats of reckless bravery. Saladin himself barely escaped, fleeing the field on a racing camel, leaving behind his personal baggage, his treasures, and his reputation for invincibility. The victory at Montgisard became legendary, celebrated as a miraculous deliverance, attributed to divine intervention, to the true cross that the Bishop of Bethlehem had carried into battle, to the special providence that God extended to the defenders of his holy places. But for Baldwin, the triumph was bittersweet, because even as the kingdom celebrated, even as his reputation soared, he knew that his capacity to repeat such feats was diminishing with each passing month. The physical demands of that battle, the hours in the saddle, the weight of armour, the shock of combat, left him drained in ways that a healthy youth would have quickly recovered from, and his physicians noted with alarm the new lesions on his body, the consequences of injuries sustained in the fight that he had not felt at the time but which now festered and refused to heal properly. The years that followed Montgisard saw Baldwin's condition deteriorate in painful increments, each loss of function forcing new adaptations, new strategies for concealing the extent of his disability from those who might exploit it. By 1180, his face bore the unmistakable marks of advanced leprosy. The nose had begun to collapse as the cartilage was destroyed, the eyebrows had thinned, the skin showed the characteristic nodules and discoloration that no amount of cosmetics or strategic lighting could fully hide. It was during this period that he began to wear coverings, masks of cloth or silver that concealed the ruin of his features while allowing him to continue to appear in public, to preside over the councils, to maintain the fiction of normalcy that the kingdom desperately needed. The mask became the symbol of his reign, a barrier between his private suffering and his public duty, a surface upon which his subjects could project their hopes and fears without having to confront the disturbing reality beneath. Medieval people understood disease differently than we do, saw in it moral and spiritual dimensions that modern medicine has stripped away, and leprosy in particular carried associations with sin, with divine punishment, with a corruption that was as much spiritual as physical. That their king suffered from this disease created a theological crisis that churchmen struggled to navigate. How could God's anointed, the defender of the Holy Sepulchre, be marked with the disease of the unclean? Some argued that this was a test, a trial like Job's, that Baldwin's virtue was being refined in the furnace of affliction, while others whispered that perhaps this was indeed divine judgment, though judgment for what sins they dared not specify too loudly. Baldwin's marriage prospects, always a crucial concern for a medieval monarch who needed to produce heirs, became a source of awkward diplomatic silence. What princess of Christendom would be offered to a leper king, no matter how brave, no matter how holy his cause? The practical reality of his condition made the idea of marriage grotesque to contemplate, and yet the kingdom needed continuity, needed the promise of an heir to stabilise the succession. The solution, such as it was, came through his sisters, Sibylla, beautiful and twice married, first to William of Montferrat, who died shortly after arriving in the Holy Land, and then to Guy of Lusignan, a Poitevin nobleman of mediocre abilities but pleasing appearance, and Isabella, much younger, married at 8 years old to Humphrey the Tharthor of Touraine, in a political alliance meant to secure the support of that important barony. Sibylla's son by William of Montferrat, a boy also named Baldwin, became in effect the heir presumptive, the vessel into which the kingdom's hopes for a future beyond the leper, King's inevitable death, were poured. But this arrangement merely displaced the crisis rather than resolving it, because who would control the kingdom during the minority of this child heir, and could the kingdom even survive long enough for him to reach his majority? The baronial factions that had always fractured Frankish politics in Outremer now oriented themselves around the succession question, forming parties that ostensibly debated policy, but were really positioning themselves for the power struggle that would come when Baldwin IV finally died. Raymond of Tripoli led one faction, the party of caution and diplomacy, arguing for truces with Saladin, for careful husbanding of the kingdom's limited resources, for avoiding the provocations that might unite the Muslim world against the Frankish states. Against him stood a more aggressive party that included Renaud of Châtillon, the adventurer who had spent 16 years in Muslim captivity and emerged with an implacable hatred for Islam and a reckless disregard for consequences, and Gerard de Riedefort, Grand Master of the Knights Templar, a man nursing personal grievances that would eventually influence strategic decisions with catastrophic results. Between these factions stood Baldwin, trying to maintain balance, to prevent either side from gaining enough power to dominate the other, to preserve the kingdom's unity even as his own body fell apart. The strain of this political tightrope walk, combined with the advancing disease, should have broken him, should have driven him to abdication or retreat into invalidism. But instead, Baldwin demonstrated a strength of will that astonished contemporaries and has puzzled historians ever since. He continued to govern, to arbitrate disputes, to plan campaigns, to conduct diplomacy, even as his eyesight began to fail, even as his limbs became progressively useless, even as the pain from secondary infections often left him prostrate for days at a time. The spring of 1180 brought a new crisis in the form of Renaud of Châtillon's marriage to Stephanie of Milly, which gave him control of the strategic fortress of Kerak, beyond the Jordan River commanding the routes between Damascus and Egypt. Renaud, free after his long captivity and determined to recoup his fortunes, immediately began raiding Muslim caravans in violation of the truces that Raymond had carefully negotiated, and when Saladin protested, Renaud contemptuously refused to cease his attacks. Baldwin, recognizing the danger but unable to directly control a baron as powerful and distant as Renaud, found himself trapped between the necessity of maintaining some authority over his vassals and the reality that his physical condition made it impossible to enforce his will through military action. The king's diminishing capacity for personal leadership in war meant that he had to rely increasingly on subordinates, and those subordinates, knowing that Baldwin's time was limited, began to act with more independence, pursuing their own agendas with less concern for the king's preferences. This erosion of royal authority accelerated in 1182, when Baldwin, now 21 and so weakened that he could no longer ride, had to be carried into battle in a litter, a mobile stretcher from which he could observe and give orders, but could not personally fight. The image of the Leper King carried into combat by his faithful knights became another element of the mythology that grew around Baldwin, evidence of his indomitable spirit, but it also marked the beginning of the end of his effective rule. That same year, Saladin launched another major invasion, besieging Beirut and ravaging the countryside, and Baldwin, determined to relieve the siege despite his condition, managed to assemble an army and march north. The Frankish relief force arrived in time to save Beirut, but the campaign illustrated how dependent the kingdom had become on the personal presence of the king, however incapacitated to unite the fractious nobility. Without Baldwin there to hold them together, the barons would pursue their private wars and vendettas. But with him present, even carried on a litter, even behind a silver mask, they would cooperate, at least minimally. This dynamic created a terrible paradox. The kingdom needed Baldwin alive to maintain any semblance of unity, but keeping him alive, forcing him to continue bearing the burden of kingship when his body screamed for rest, was a kind of cruelty that no one wanted to acknowledge. The physicians who attended Baldwin could offer little beyond palliatives. Medieval medicine had no cure for leprosy, barely understood its mechanism, could only treat symptoms and try to prevent secondary infections with their limited pharmacopoeia of herbs, compounds and prayers. The disease followed its inexorable course, destroying nerve after nerve, leaving behind a dead zones of flesh that Baldwin could injure without knowing, that would ulcerate and become infected, that would sometimes require amputation of fingers or toes that had become gangrenous. By 1183, Baldwin was blind, or nearly so, his eyes clouded by the disease, and he had lost most of his extremities to progressive necrosis, yet still he clung to power, still he tried to govern, dictating orders to scribes, listening to reports read aloud, maintaining through sheer force of personality and legitimacy a grasp on authority that his physical state made absurd. It was in this condition, blind and fingerless, his face completely hidden behind elaborate coverings, that Baldwin made what might be considered his greatest political mistake or his most desperate gamble. He arranged for his sister Sibylla to be married to Guy of Lusignan. Guy was handsome, brave in a conventional way, and utterly lacking in the political sophistication that the Kingdom of Jerusalem required. Raymond of Tripoli and the other senior barons opposed the match, recognising Guy's inadequacies, but Baldwin, perhaps influenced by his mother Agnes of Courtenay who supported Guy, perhaps simply exhausted by the factional fighting and hoping that a decisive choice would end the paralysis, approved the marriage. The wedding took place at Easter in 1180, and with it came the implication that Guy, as husband to the king's heir, would have a claim to the regency and possibly the throne itself. This prospect horrified Raymond's party, who saw in Guy not merely incompetence, but the ascendancy of a faction they despised, and the kingdom split more sharply than ever between those who would accept Guy's eventual rule and those who would resist it. Baldwin, watching this split widen, tried to correct his error by having his young nephew, Sibylla's son Baldwin IV, crowned as co-king in 1183, an unprecedented move designed to secure the succession through the child and bypass Guy. But this merely added another layer of complexity to an already impossible situation. The crisis reached its peak in the summer of 1183, when Saladin launched what he intended to be the final assault on the Crusader kingdom. The Sultan crossed the Jordan River with a massive army and laid siege to Kerak Castle during a wedding feast, trapping many of the kingdom's nobility inside the fortress. Baldwin, by now so weak that his survival day-to-day seemed miraculous, somehow mustered the strength to organise a relief force. He could not lead it himself. That was now impossible. So he appointed Guy of Lusignan to command the army, a decision that should have been a test of Guy's capabilities. The Frankish army assembled at the Pools of Goliath and marched toward Kerak, and Saladin, learning of their approach, positioned his forces to intercept them. Here was Guy's moment to prove himself, to demonstrate the military ability that a king of Jerusalem absolutely required, and he failed utterly. Faced with Saladin's army, Guy hesitated, refused to give battle, and eventually withdrew, leaving Kerak to be relieved only when Saladin, for his own strategic reasons, decided to lift the siege. The humiliation was complete. Guy had shown himself to be a coward, or at least too cautious to be trusted with command in the desperate circumstances that faced the kingdom. Baldwin, informed of this failure, acted with a decisiveness that his physical state made remarkable. He removed Guy from any position of authority, effectively disinheriting Sibylla by declaring that the crown would pass to young Baldwin IV, with Raymond of Tripoli as regent. This decision, made in late 1183 or early 1184, represented Baldwin IV's final assertion of royal authority, his last attempt to save the kingdom from the consequences of his own mortality. The effort required to make this decision, to enforce it against the opposition of his mother and sister, to reorganise the succession while blind and partially paralysed, exhausted what remained of Baldwin's strength. he withdrew from active governance, delegating to Raymond the day-to-day administration of the kingdom while he lingered in his chambers, attended by physicians and priests who could do nothing but ease his passage toward death. The young king who had defeated Saladin at Montgisard, who had held together a fractious kingdom through the force of his will and the legitimacy of his crown, was now reduced to a dying body maintained in a state of living death, useful to the kingdom only as a symbol, a name to invoke, a source of legitimacy for decisions made by others. Yet even in this state, Baldwin remained conscious, remained aware of what was happening around him, remained trapped in a body that had become a prison from which the only escape was death. The psychological torment of this condition, the sheer horror of being fully aware while one's body slowly necrotized, while one's face became a mask of disease, while the normal human pleasures of touch and sight and physical autonomy were stripped away one by one, defies adequate description. Medieval chroniclers, even those like William of Tyre who knew Baldwin personally, tended to treat his suffering in conventional religious terms, as a trial or a martyrdom, but the lived reality must have been infinitely worse than their pious generalization suggested. The political situation during Baldwin's final months became increasingly Byzantine, as various factions manoeuvred for position in the post-Baldwin world. Raymond of Tripoli, as regent for the child Baldwin V, held the reins of government but faced constant opposition from those who supported Guy of Lusignan and Sibylla's claim. Agnes of Courtenay, the king's mother, wielded influence through her network of clients and her positions of patronage, supporting her son's decisions when they aligned with her interests but working against him when they didn't. The military orders, the Templars and Hospitallers, pursued their own agendas, sometimes supporting the crown, sometimes acting independently, always conscious that their international connections and independent resources gave them leverage that secular lords lacked. The Italian merchant communes of Venice, Genoa, and Pisa competed for commercial privileges and political influence, their trading networks vital to the kingdom's economy, but their factional disputes adding another layer of division to an already fractured polity. The native Christian population, the Syrian and Armenian Christians who had lived in these lands long before the Franks arrived, watched the internal struggles of their rulers with a mixture of anxiety and calculation, aware that their own survival depended on the outcome but having little direct influence on it. And beyond the borders, Saladin watched and waited, rebuilding his forces after the campaigns of the early 1180s, biding his time until the Frankish kingdom's internal contradictions tore it apart. Baldwin IV had died in March or May of 1185. The exact date is uncertain, lost in the confused chronology of the period at the age of 23 or 24, having reigned for 11 years. The last several of which he spent in a condition that most people would have considered worse than death. The circumstances of his final days remain obscure. The chronicles that describe his reign in such detail fall strangely silent about its end, perhaps because there was nothing edifying to say, nothing that fit the narrative conventions of medieval historiography. Did he die in agony, consumed by fever from some final infection? Did he slip away quietly, exhausted beyond the capacity to struggle further? Did he welcome death as a release, or did he fight against it to the last, unwilling to abandon the kingdom he had tried so hard to preserve? We cannot know, can only imagine the scene. The darkened chamber in the Palace of Jerusalem, the smell of disease and incense, the murmured prayers of priests, the weeping of those few who had remained loyal, and at the centre of it all the wasted body of a young man who had tried to be a king and had succeeded at terrible cost. His nephew Baldwin V succeeded him as had been arranged, with Raymond of Tripoli as regent, and for a brief moment it seemed that the old king's final dispositions might hold. But the child king, never healthy, died himself within a year, and with his death the carefully constructed succession plan collapsed. Sibylla and Guy of Lusignan seized the throne in a coup d'etat, orchestrated with the support of the Templars and the Patriarch of Jerusalem, bypassing the claims of Isabella and the opposition of Raymond's party. The coronation of Sibylla and Guy in September 1186 represented the final failure of everything Baldwin IV had tried to accomplish in his last years, the triumph of the faction he had sought to exclude, the victory of mediocrity and ambition over capability and caution, and the consequences came swiftly. Guy, proving himself as incompetent as king as he had been as commander, allowed himself to be provoked by Renaud of Chatillon's latest outrage, an attack on a Muslim caravan that violated the truce and gave Saladin the justification he needed for total war. In July 1187, less than 2 years after Baldwin IV's death, Guy led the army of the kingdom into the waterless hills around the Horns of Hattin, where Saladin surrounded and destroyed them in one of the most complete military disasters of the medieval period. The Holy Cross, carried into battle as it had been at Montgisard, was captured and lost. The military orders were decimated, their grand masters killed or captured. The nobility of the kingdom was either dead or in chains, and 3 months later, on October 2nd, 1187, Saladin entered Jerusalem as a conqueror, ending 88 years of Frankish rule over the Holy City. The Kingdom of Jerusalem would continue in name, reduced to a coastal strip, sustained by the Third Crusade and subsequent waves of reinforcements from Europe, but it never recovered what was lost at Hattin, never regained Jerusalem except for a brief period through negotiation, never recaptured the moment of possibility that had existed during Baldwin IV's reign, when a different succession, a different set of choices, might have preserved the Frankish presence in the Levant for generations longer. Historians debating the fall of the Crusader kingdom often focus on the structural weaknesses that made collapse inevitable: the demographic imbalance, the military superiority of the surrounding Muslim powers, the distance from European support, the internal divisions that prevented unified action. All of these factors mattered, but they were constants throughout the kingdom's existence, present during its periods of success as much as during its final crisis. What made the difference, what transformed latent weaknesses into catastrophic failure, was the succession crisis that Baldwin IV's disease created and that his death failed to resolve. A healthy Baldwin, living a normal lifespan, producing heirs, providing continuous leadership, might have managed these structural problems as his predecessors had done. But Baldwin was not healthy, could not live a normal lifespan, could not produce heirs, and the desperate expedients adopted to cope with his condition ultimately doomed the kingdom he loved. Yet the tragedy of Baldwin IV resides not merely in these grand historical consequences, but in the personal dimension, in the lived experience of a young man who found himself simultaneously elevated to supreme power and condemned to progressive physical destruction. From the moment he recognized what the numbness in his hand meant, Baldwin knew that his life would be short and painful, that he would never know the normal pleasures of youth, that he would watch his own body decay while remaining conscious within it. He knew that people looked at him with a mixture of pity and revulsion, that the mask he wore to hide his ruined face became in itself an object of fascinated horror, that the disease that was killing him also marked him as unclean in the eyes of many who professed to serve him. He knew that his condition made him unmarriageable, that he would never experience love or intimacy, that the dynasty would pass through his sisters rather than through children of his own body, and he knew, with the clear-eyed intelligence that William of Tyre had fostered, that his kingdom was probably doomed, that the forces arrayed against it were too powerful, that the internal divisions were too deep, that his own death would likely trigger the collapse of everything his family had built over nearly a century. This knowledge, this awareness of futility combined with the compulsion to continue trying, defined Baldwin's existence during the decade of his active reign. He could not simply give up, could not abdicate, because to do so would be to admit that his life, his suffering had no purpose, and also because there was no one to whom he could abdicate who would clearly be better than him, disease and all. So he persisted, performing the role of king even when his body made that performance grotesque, presiding over councils he could not see, signing documents with hands that could barely hold a pen, riding into battle on a litter because he could no longer sit a horse. The courage this required was of a different order than the battlefield courage celebrated in chivalric romance. It was the courage to endure humiliation, to accept dependency, to continue struggling when every rational calculation suggested that struggle was pointless. Medieval culture provided a framework for understanding this kind of suffering through the theology of martyrdom and the examples of saints who had endured torments for their faith, and Baldwin's contemporaries often cast him in these terms, as a holy sufferer whose affliction brought him closer to Christ. William of Tyre, writing his chronicle in the years after Baldwin's death, presented the king as a figure of admirable virtue precisely because he bore his suffering with patience and continued to fulfill his royal duties despite his condition, and this interpretation influenced subsequent medieval writers who encountered Baldwin's story. But there was another dimension to Baldwin's suffering that the pious chroniclers could not fully acknowledge, a dimension of anger and frustration and fear that breaks through occasionally in the historical record. When Baldwin removed Guy of Lusignan from authority after the Carac debacle, he was not merely making a rational political decision. He was expressing rage at incompetence, fury that the man to whom he had entrusted command had failed, bitterness that the succession he had arranged was proving to be a disaster. When he insisted on being carried into battle in 1182 and 1183, despite the obvious fact that he could contribute little to the fighting, he was not merely fulfilling a symbolic function, he was asserting his identity as a warrior king, refusing to let the disease define him completely, claiming a space of masculine agency in a culture that equated masculinity with physical prowess and martial ability. When he secluded himself behind masks and veils, he was not merely protecting others from the sight of his diseased face. He was creating a private space where he did not have to perform health or normalcy, where he could simply exist without the constant awareness of being looked at, judged, pitted. The psychological complexity of Baldwin's experience exceeds what the medieval sources can convey, filtered as they are through conventions of religious interpretation and chivalric idealization, but it emerges nonetheless in the gaps and silences of the chronicles, in the moments when the narrative seems inadequate to the reality it describes. The question of what sustained Baldwin through his ordeal has no simple answer, involves a combination of religious faith, sense of duty, personal pride, and perhaps simply the biological imperative to survive that persists even when survival has become a burden. Medieval Christianity provided powerful resources for making sense of suffering, interpreting it as spiritually meaningful rather than merely pointless, as an opportunity for purification and growth rather than simple loss. Baldwin would have been taught that his suffering could be offered up, united with Christ's suffering on the cross, transformed from meaningless pain into redemptive sacrifice. He would have believed, with the sincere faith of his era, that his earthly afflictions were temporary, that beyond death lay the promise of resurrection in a glorified body free from disease, that the humiliations he endured in this life would be compensated by glory in the next. This framework genuinely helped medieval people endure conditions that seem unendurable to modern sensibilities, provided cognitive and emotional tools for processing experiences of extreme suffering without descending into despair. But religious faith, however sincere, does not eliminate pain, does not make betrayal less bitter, does not remove the desire for things one cannot have, and Baldwin's piety, well attested in the sources, coexisted with very human feelings of loss and frustration. His sense of duty to the kingdom, inculcated by his education and reinforced by his position, also sustained him, gave him a reason to continue when personal reasons might have failed. Baldwin understood himself as part of a historical project, the crusade to maintain Christian control of the Holy Land, and he understood his role as essential to that project's success or failure. To abandon that role would be to betray not merely his immediate subjects, but the generations of crusaders who had fought and died to establish the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and also to betray the future, the possibility that Christian rule in the Holy Land might endure and expand. This sense of historical mission was not unique to Baldwin. It motivated many medieval rulers, but in his case it took on special poignancy because his disease made every day a struggle, made the performance of duty physically agonizing in ways that healthy monarchs never experienced. A healthy king might take for granted his ability to appear in public, to lead armies, to conduct the rituals of kingship, but for Baldwin each of these actions required extraordinary effort, required overcoming not merely the disease itself but the shame and self-consciousness that the disease produced. The personal relationships that Baldwin maintained during his years as king remain largely opaque to historical investigation, mentioned only glancingly in sources concerned primarily with political and military events. We know that his mother Agnes remained influential and involved in his life, though whether their relationship was warm or merely dutiful the sources do not say. We know that William of Tyre continued to serve as a counsellor and administrator, though the chronicle William wrote avoids discussing his personal feelings about his former pupil's suffering. We know that Raymond of Tripoli gained Baldwin's trust to the point where the king appointed him regent, which suggests some degree of personal connection beyond mere political calculation. But the inner circle, the companions and confidants who might have provided emotional support, remain shadowy figures, and we can only speculate about whether Baldwin found comfort in friendship or whether his disease isolated him too completely for genuine intimacy. The stigma associated with leprosy would have created barriers even with those who accepted his political authority, made casual physical contact impossible, introduced an element of fear and revulsion into every interaction, no matter how much people might have respected him, intellectually, or admired his courage. There are suggestions in the sources, never fully developed, that Baldwin experienced moments of black depression, times when the weight of his suffering and his responsibilities became too much to bear. After the failure at Kerak and the removal of Guy from authority, Baldwin apparently withdrew from active involvement in governance for a period, and while this might have been due simply to physical exhaustion, it might also have represented a kind of breakdown, a moment when even his formidable will could not sustain the effort required to continue. The final year or two of his life, when he had been rendered almost completely incapacitated, must have been psychologically devastating, a period of radical dependency and loss of agency that would challenge any person's mental stability. That Baldwin retained enough clarity and determination to arrange the succession in favour of his nephew to secure Raymond's regency suggests that he did not entirely succumb to despair, but the cost of maintaining that clarity can only be imagined. The modern understanding of chronic illness and disability recognises that psychological suffering is not a secondary effect but an integral part of the experience, that pain and physical limitation reshape one's entire relationship to the world and to oneself, and while medieval people lacked this psychological framework, they nevertheless experienced these dimensions of suffering, processed them through the conceptual resources available to them, and sometimes buckled under the strain. Baldwin's religious devotion, noted by multiple chroniclers, may have intensified during his final years as his condition worsened and death approached. The palace in Jerusalem was adjacent to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and Baldwin would have had access to the most sacred site in Christendom, the place where Christ was believed to have been crucified and resurrected. For a deeply religious medieval Christian facing death from a disfiguring disease, the proximity to this site would have carried enormous emotional and spiritual significance, offered the possibility of contemplating one's own suffering in direct relation to Christ's sacrifice, of literally being near the place where death had been defeated and the promise of resurrection validated. The liturgical calendar that structured medieval time included frequent observances of martyrs and saints who had suffered and died for their faith, and Baldwin participating in these observances would have encountered repeated affirmations that suffering borne faithfully had meaning and value. The sacraments, particularly confession and communion, would have provided regular opportunities for spiritual renewal and reassurance of divine grace, and the presence of clergy, monks, and holy men who could offer counsel and prayer would have created a support structure specifically designed to help the suffering make sense of their condition. Yet religion could also intensify suffering, create additional layers of fear and guilt that compounded the physical and emotional pain. If disease was understood as potentially divine punishment, then one might torture oneself with questions about what sin could have merited such severe chastisement, might search one's conscience obsessively for faults that could explain why God had singled one out for this particular affliction. If physical purity was associated with moral purity, then the progressive corruption of one's body might seem to suggest a corresponding spiritual corruption, a fear that would be particularly acute for someone in Baldwin's position who was supposed to be God's anointed representative. If the resurrection of the body was promised, but one's current body was so ruined and disfigured, questions might arise about what form that resurrection would take, whether one would be restored to wholeness or remain somehow marked by the earthly suffering. These theological anxieties, rarely articulated directly in medieval sources, but present nonetheless in the devotional literature and pastoral guidance of the period, would have been available to trouble Baldwin's mind during the long hours of pain and sleeplessness that his condition must have caused. The historical irony of Baldwin's situation, that he suffered from a disease associated with divine disfavour while ruling the holiest kingdom in Christendom, that he defended Jerusalem while being himself in some sense unclean, that he embodied both the height of earthly power and the depth of physical degradation, creates a symbolism almost too perfect, too literary, and yet this was the lived reality, not a constructed narrative. The mask that Baldwin wore in his later years became the outward sign of this irony, a surface that could be made beautiful and kingly while concealing the ruined flesh beneath, a barrier between the ideal of kingship and the messy reality of a diseased body. Medieval political theology held that the king had two bodies, the mortal, fallible body of the individual man and the immortal, perfect body politic that he represented. In most cases, this remained an abstraction, a theoretical distinction. But in Baldwin's case, the gap between these two bodies became grotesquely literal, visible in the contrast between the crowned figure on the throne and the leprous flesh that occupied that throne. This disjunction challenged the usual assumptions about the relationship between physical and political bodies, raised uncomfortable questions about what happened when the king's mortal body became so degraded that it seemed to mock the dignity of the body politic he represented. Some modern historians, approaching Baldwin's reign from perspectives informed by disability studies and critical analysis of bodily norms, have argued that Baldwin's successful exercise of kingship, despite his disease challenges, medieval and modern assumptions about the necessity of physical wholeness for political authority. From this perspective, Baldwin's reign demonstrates that leadership capacity, strategic intelligence, moral authority, and political legitimacy are not dependent on bodily intactness, that a disabled ruler can be as effective or more effective than an able-bodied one. This reading recovers Baldwin from the solely tragic narrative, recognizes the agency and competence he demonstrated, rather than defining him purely by his suffering. At the same time, such interpretations must acknowledge that Baldwin operated within a medieval context that did link bodily wholeness to political fitness, that his disease created genuine obstacles to his exercise of power, and that the kingdom's ultimate fate suggests that however admirable his personal qualities, the structural problems his condition created proved insurmountable. The tension between these perspectives, between celebrating Baldwin's achievements and recognizing the tragedy of his situation, reflects broader debates about how to understand disability historically, how to avoid either romanticizing suffering or reducing disabled individuals to passive victims. In the immediate aftermath of Baldwin's death, his reputation remained high. William of Tyre and other chroniclers who had known him personally wrote admiringly of his courage and virtue. But as the disaster of Hattin unfolded and Jerusalem fell, some chroniclers began to interpret Baldwin's disease differently, to suggest that it had been a warning sign, a divine indication that the kingdom was under judgment for its sins. This retrospective reinterpretation, common in medieval historiography when trying to explain catastrophic defeats, complicated Baldwin's legacy, left it poised between admiration for his personal heroism and a sense that his affliction had somehow presaged the kingdom's doom. Later medieval and early modern writers, often working from summary accounts rather than detailed chronicles, sometimes garbled the facts, confused Baldwin IV with other rulers, or reduced his story to a simple morality tale about suffering and virtue. The mask particularly fascinated these later writers, who embellished it in various ways, sometimes describing it as silver, sometimes as gold, sometimes as jewelled, transforming it from a practical medical covering into a symbol of hidden identity and mysterious suffering. Modern scholarly treatment of Baldwin IV has varied depending on the broader interpretive frameworks historians bring to Crusader history. 19th century Romantic historians, fascinated by medieval chivalry and inclined toward dramatic narratives, produced highly coloured accounts of the Leper King that emphasised his tragic heroism and made him a figure of pathos. Early 20th century historians, influenced by scientific positivism and sceptical of religious motives, tended to downplay the personal dimension and focus on the structural political and military factors that shaped his reign. More recent scholarship, benefiting from better understanding of leprosy and medieval medicine, from more sophisticated analysis of medieval political culture, and from comparative study of other medieval kingdoms facing succession crises, has produced more nuanced interpretations that recognise both Baldwin's individual agency and the constraints within which he operated. The medical understanding of leprosy has evolved dramatically. Modern scholarship recognises it as caused by Mycobacterium leprae, transmitted through prolonged close contact, progressing slowly over years or decades, and manifesting in different forms depending on the individual's immune response. The lepromatous form, which Baldwin appears to have had, attacks peripheral nerves and skin, causes the loss of sensation that leads to unnoticed injuries and secondary infections, and can progress to the severe facial disfigurement that the sources describe. This medical knowledge allows us to reconstruct with some confidence what Baldwin experienced physically, even if the psychological and emotional dimensions remain more speculative. The question of how Baldwin contracted leprosy remains unanswered. The disease existed in medieval Europe and the Middle East, and exposure could have occurred in numerous ways during his childhood. Some writers have suggested that he might have been born with it, that the disease was present but undetected in infancy and early childhood until the symptoms became unmistakable in adolescence, which would fit with the medical understanding of leprosy's long incubation period. Others have proposed that he contracted it after birth through contact with infected individuals, perhaps servants or caretakers, or even from his father, who died of a disease that some historians have speculated might have been leprosy misdiagnosed as dysentery, though the evidence for this is thin. The stigma associated with leprosy would have created strong incentives to conceal any family history of the disease, so even if there were genetic or familial factors, the sources would be unlikely to mention them. What matters for understanding Baldwin's reign is not the etiology of his individual case, but the fact that he developed a progressively disabling disease at the moment he assumed political power, creating the impossible situation that defined the rest of his life. The physical environment in which Baldwin lived and died, the palace and city of Jerusalem in the late 12th century, can be reconstructed from archaeological evidence and the descriptions of pilgrims and chroniclers who visited during this period. Jerusalem under Frankish rule had been substantially rebuilt and modified from the city that existed before the First Crusade, with new churches, fortifications, markets and residential quarters reflecting European architectural styles adapted to the local climate and available materials. The royal palace, located near the Tower of David and the Jaffa Gate, had been constructed and expanded by Baldwin's predecessors, included both ceremonial spaces for public functions and private chambers for the royal family. The city's population was diverse, including Frankish settlers, native Christian communities of various sects, Muslims who had remained under Christian rule, and Jewish residents, creating a complex cultural environment where multiple languages, customs and religious traditions coexisted uneasily. This diversity, often celebrated in modern accounts as evidence of medieval tolerance, was in fact structured by strict hierarchies of power and sharp religious boundaries, with the Frankish minority maintaining dominance through military force and the privileges of conquest. Living as a leper king in this environment would have created particular challenges. Baldwin needed to maintain the public visibility that medieval kingship required, while managing a disease that medieval culture stigmatized and feared. The palace would have been adapted to accommodate his increasing disability. Doorways widened to allow passage of the litter on which he was carried, chambers arranged to minimize the need for movement, servants trained to assist with intimate tasks that he could no longer perform himself. The silver mask and covering garments served not merely medical purposes but theatrical ones, allowing Baldwin to appear before his court and subjects in a way that preserved the visual dignity of kingship while concealing the physical reality beneath. The chronicle accounts of his later public appearances emphasize his voice, still strong and commanding, issuing from behind the mask, suggesting that as his body failed, he relied increasingly on verbal rather than physical expressions of authority. The image this creates, the concealed king speaking orders he could not personally enforce, maintaining power through legitimacy and personality when the usual embodied performances of medieval monarchy had become impossible, captures the strange liminal quality of Baldwin's final years. The emotional climate of the court during these years must have been extraordinarily tense, with everyone aware that the king was dying, that the succession was contested, that the external threats were mounting, that decisions made now would determine whether the kingdom survived, and yet constrained by the protocols of monarchy from openly acknowledging these anxieties. Courtiers would have positioned themselves carefully, maintaining outward loyalty to Baldwin while privately aligning with whichever faction they expected to prevail after his death. Conversations would have been guarded, filled with double meanings and strategic silences, as people tried to navigate between conflicting loyalties and uncertain futures. Baldwin himself, isolated by his disease and his position, would have been intensely aware of these undercurrents, would have known that many who professed devotion were actually calculating their advantage in the coming power struggle, would have experienced the peculiar loneliness of the dying monarch who cannot trust even his closest advisors to tell him the truth. The final arrangements for the succession, with young Baldwin IV as designated heir and Raymond as regent, represented Baldwin IV's last attempt to impose order on the chaos he knew would follow his death, and the fact that these arrangements failed so quickly suggests how much his personal authority had been holding together a polity that was already fragmenting.